At 2200 hours on the night of July 15th, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami stood on the bridge of the destroyer Amagiri, watching the dark water of Blackett Strait slide past his bow. The moon was a thin crescent, barely visible through broken clouds. Good. Darkness was his ally tonight. Darkness meant American aircraft could not find him. Darkness meant he could complete this run, deliver his cargo, and return to Rabaul before dawn. Hanami was 34 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, class of 1931. He had served on destroyers for 12 years, knew these ships like he knew his own body. Every sound the engines made, every vibration through the deck plates, every smell from the boiler rooms. Amagiri was making 28 knots, a good speed for these waters, fast enough to outrun trouble, slow enough to maneuver through the channels between islands. Behind him, 3 other destroyers followed in, Column, Shigure, Hagikaze, and Arashi. 4 destroyers carrying supplies for the garrison on Kolombangara Island. Ammunition, medical supplies, rice. 200 tons of cargo lashed to their decks because their holds were filled with troops, 700 soldiers being rotated forward to replace casualties. It was a standard Tokyo Express run. Hanami had made 17 of these runs in the past 8 months. 17 trips down the slot, the narrow channel through the Solomon Islands, delivering supplies to isolated garrisons that could not be reached any other way. The Americans owned the daylight. Their aircraft from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal controlled the skies from dawn to dusk. Any Japanese ship caught in these waters during daylight hours would be bombed until it sank. But, at night, the destroyers ruled. Fast, heavily armed, they could race down the slot, deliver their cargo, and escape north before the sun rose. The Americans had PT boats, small patrol torpedo boats, that attacked at night. Hanami had encountered them before. They were a nuisance, nothing more. His intelligence briefing that morning in Rabaul had been specific. Enemy PT boat activity in the Central Solomons estimated at moderate levels. 12 to 15 boats operational between Rendova and Vella La Vella. Recommend standard evasive procedures. 12 to 15 boats spread across 100 miles of ocean. The odds of encountering more than 2 or 3 in a single night were minimal, and if he did encounter them, Amagiri could handle them. His destroyer displaced 2,000 tons, mounted 6 5-inch guns, could make 35 knots at flank speed. PT boats were 80-foot wooden craft with thin hulls that a single 5-inch shell could blow apart. Hanami's executive officer, Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura, stood beside him on the bridge. Nakamura was younger, 26, on his first deployment to the Solomons. He had arrived in Rabaul 3 weeks ago, full of confidence, eager to prove himself. That confidence had faded after his first Tokyo Express run, when their destroyer had been attacked by 2 PT boats near Vila. The attack had been brief, poorly coordinated. Both torpedoes missed. Amagiri's guns had driven the boats away without difficulty, but Nakamura had seen how fast the boats moved, how hard they were to hit in darkness, how close the torpedoes had come. "Lookouts report all clear, sir," Nakamura said. His voice was steady, professional, but Hanami heard the underlying tension. Every man on the bridge was tense. They were deep in American-controlled waters now, 40 miles south of their base at Vila, approaching the narrowest part of Blackett Strait, where the channel between Kolombangara and Arundel Island was less than 2 miles wide. "Maintain current speed and heading," Hanami ordered. "Signal to the formation. Stay alert. We're in the danger zone now." The danger zone. That's what destroyer captains called the Central Solomons. 6 months ago, these waters had been relatively safe. PT boat attacks were rare, easily evaded. But something had changed in recent months. The attacks were coming more frequently, with more boats, better coordinated. Last month, the destroyer Niizuki had been sunk in these same waters, torpedoed by PT boats, and finished off by air attack at dawn. The week before that, the transport Tsurugi Maru had been hit and forced to beach herself on Kolombangara, her cargo lost. Hanami checked his watch. 22:15. They would reach the delivery point at Vila Harbour by 2300 hours, offload quickly, and begin the return journey by midnight. If everything went according to plan, they would be north of Vela La Vela by 0300, safely beyond the range of American PT boat bases. Dawn would find them approaching Bougainville, where Japanese air cover could protect them for the final leg to Rabaul, if everything went according to plan. But Hanami had learned that plans rarely survived contact with reality in these waters. At 22:30, the lookout called down from the crow's nest. "Multiple contacts, bearing 045, range estimated 5,000 meters." Hanami grabbed his binoculars, scanning the darkness to the northeast. At first he saw nothing but black water and the darker mass of Kolombangara's jungle-covered hills. Then he saw them. Wakes. White lines cutting through the dark water, phosphorescence churned up by propellers, visible even in the dim moonlight. He counted them quickly. 5 wakes. No. 6. 7. PT boats, Nakamura said quietly. At least 7. Hanami kept counting. 8. 9. 10. His stomach tightened. 10 boats? The intelligence briefing had said 12 to 15 boats total in the entire area. But there were 10 boats right here, right now, all converging on his formation. "Signal to the formation," Hanami ordered, keeping his voice calm. "Enemy PT boats bearing 045. Increase speed to flank. Prepare to engage." Amagiri's engines roared louder as the throttles opened fully. The destroyer surged forward, her bow wave rising, her stern settling as 35 knots of speed pushed her through the water. Behind her, the other 3 destroyers matched her acceleration. The formation spread out, giving each ship room to maneuver, opening fields of fire for their guns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The gun crews were already at their stations, had been since the destroyers entered the strait. Now they trained their weapons toward the approaching boats. 5-inch guns, 25mm anti-aircraft guns, 13mm machine guns. Amagiri carried enough firepower to destroy a dozen PT boats if she could hit them, but hitting them was the problem. The boats were small, fast, maneuverable. They could turn on their own length, could accelerate to 40 knots in seconds. And they attacked at night when visibility was measured in hundreds of meters, when targets appeared and disappeared in seconds. Hanami watched the wakes drawing closer. The PT boats were not trying to hide. They were coming straight at the destroyer formation, line abreast, coordinated. This was not the cautious, probing attack he had experienced before. This was aggressive, confident. These boats were hunting. At 3,000 meters, Amagiri's forward 5-inch gun opened fire. The muzzle flash lit up the bridge, momentarily destroying Hanami's night vision. He blinked away the afterimage, watching for the shell splash. The round landed short, a waterspout rising 50 meters ahead of the lead PT boat. The gun crew adjusted, fired again. This round was closer, landing just ahead of the boat. The boat veered left, then cut back right, zigzagging, making itself a difficult target. The other guns joined in. The night erupted with muzzle flashes and the sharp crack of 5-inch guns firing rapidly. Tracers from the smaller caliber weapons reached out toward the PT boats, red lines in the darkness. The boats kept coming. They were at 2,000 meters now, close enough for Hanami to see their hulls through his binoculars, low dark shapes throwing up enormous rooster-tail wakes as they raced across the water at maximum speed. Then the PT boats split up. The line abreast formation dissolved into chaos. Boats peeled off in different directions, some turning north, others south, 2 cutting across the front of the destroyer formation. Hanami watched, trying to track them all, realizing he could not. There were too many, moving too fast, in too many directions. "They're trying to surround us," Nakamura said. He was right. The PT boats were not making a simple torpedo run and withdrawing. They were maneuvering into attack positions on all sides of the destroyer formation, splitting the Japanese guns, forcing the destroyers to defend from multiple directions simultaneously. This was sophisticated tactics, far more advanced than anything Hanami had seen before. Hard right rudder, Hanami ordered. All guns, engage targets of opportunity. Amagiri heeled over as her rudder bit, turning away from the main concentration of PT boats, presenting her stern to reduce her target profile. The 5-inch guns continued firing, their crews working frantically to load, aim, fire, load again. Shell casings piled up on the deck. The gun barrels began to glow faintly from the heat of continuous firing. At 1,500 meters, the PT boats began launching torpedoes. Hanami saw the splashes as torpedoes entered the water, saw the white wakes streaking toward his ship. 4 torpedoes, 6, 8. More than he could count. The wakes crisscrossed the water like white threads being woven on a dark loom. Torpedoes in the water, multiple torpedoes, the lookout shouted unnecessarily. Everyone on the bridge could see them now. Hanami ordered evasive maneuvers, hard left rudder, then hard right, zigzagging to avoid the torpedo tracks. Amagiri responded well, her hull cutting through the water at high speed, her rudder throwing her into tight turns. The first torpedoes passed down the port side, missing by 50 meters. The next salvo came from a different angle. Hanami watched them approach, calculated their speed and trajectory, ordered another turn. These passed down the starboard side, close enough that Hanami could have reached down and touched them if the deck extended that far. But while Amagiri evaded, the other destroyers were less fortunate. Hanami heard an explosion behind him, turned to see a massive column of water and fire rising from Shigure's port side. The destroyer staggered, her speed dropping instantly. Smoke poured from her amidships section. She had been hit. Then Hanami saw something that made his blood freeze. More wakes, more PT boats. Not the 10 boats he had initially seen, but another group, coming from the southwest, from the direction of Rendover Island. He counted them quickly. 8 boats. No, 10, 12, 22 PT boats. 22 boats attacking his 4-destroyer formation. The intelligence briefing had said 12 to 15 boats total in the entire Central Solomons. But there were 22 boats right here, in Blackett Strait, attacking simultaneously in a coordinated operation that suggested careful planning and excellent communications. This was not possible. This should not be possible. "Sir, more contacts," the lookout called. "Bearing 270, multiple boats approaching from the west." Hanami swung his binoculars to the west. More wakes. He counted them, his hands beginning to shake. 6 boats. 8. 10. Another group, coming from the direction of the PT boat base at Lever Harbour. 32 PT boats. 32 boats converging on his destroyers from 3 different directions, launching torpedoes from multiple angles, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm his defences. This was not a nuisance. This was not a minor threat to be brushed aside. This was an ambush on a scale Hanami had never imagined possible. All ships emergency speed north. Hanami radioed to the formation. "Abort mission." Repeat, "Abort mission." All ships withdraw immediately. But it was too late for coordination. The destroyer formation had already dissolved into individual ships fighting for survival. Shigure was crippled, limping north at 15 knots, smoke pouring from her damaged engine room. Hagikaze was surrounded by PT boats, her guns firing in all directions, engaging targets that appeared out of the darkness, launched torpedoes, and disappeared before they could be destroyed. Arashi was accelerating north at maximum speed, abandoning the formation, her captain making the same decision Hanami had just made. "Run! Get out of the killing zone before more torpedoes found their targets." Amagiri twisted through the water, like a live thing, turning hard left to avoid one set of torpedoes, then hard right to evade another. The PT boats were everywhere now, darting in close to launch torpedoes at point-blank range, then racing away before the 5-inch guns could track them. Hanami's gun crews were firing blindly into the darkness, unable to identify specific targets, just shooting at muzzle flashes and wakes, and anything that moved. A PT boat appeared off the starboard bow, less than 500 meters away, charging straight at Amagiri. Hanami saw it clearly in the muzzle flashes from his own guns. An 80-foot wooden hull painted dark grey, 3 men visible on the deck, torpedo tubes trained toward his ship. The forward 5-inch gun fired, the shell passing over the boat, missing by meters. The boat kept coming, impossible close now, 300 meters, 200. "Brace for impact," Hanami shouted. But the PT boat did not fire torpedoes. Instead, at the last possible moment, it turned hard, left, cutting across Amagiri's bow, machine guns firing, tracers walking across the destroyer's superstructure. Bullets clanged off metal, shattered glass in the bridge windows. Nakamura cried out, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead where flying glass had struck him. A sailor at the helm slumped forward, dead, a bullet through his chest. Then the PT boat was gone, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. But Hanami understood what had just happened. That boat had not been trying to sink Amagiri. It had been trying to force the destroyer to maneuver, to slow down, to present a better target for other boats attacking from different angles. These were coordinated tactics, boats working together, setting up kills for each other. Another explosion, this one from Hagikaze. Hanami turned to see the destroyer's forward section lifting out of the water, her bow rising at an impossible angle. She had taken a torpedo hit in the forward magazine. The secondary explosion tore her in half. Her bow section broke away, sinking immediately. Her stern section remained afloat for perhaps 30 seconds, men jumping from the decks into the water before it too rolled over and disappeared beneath the black surface. 300 men had been aboard Hagikaze. 300 men now in the water, in darkness, in shark-infested seas, 40 miles from the nearest friendly shore. There was nothing Hanami could do for them. Stopping meant death for his own ship and crew. The PT boats were still attacking, still launching torpedoes, still coordinating their assault with terrifying efficiency. Hanami checked his tactical situation. Shigure was crippled, barely moving. Hagikaze was gone. Arashi had escaped north and was out of visual range. Amagiri was surrounded by at least 20 PT boats, with more arriving constantly. Every direction he looked, he saw wakes, white lines cutting through the water, boats maneuvering for attack positions. This was not a battle Hanami could win. The mathematics were impossible. Even if his guns destroyed half the attacking boats, there would still be more than enough to sink every destroyer in his formation. And his guns were not destroying half the boats. They were barely hitting any boats at all. The PT craft were too fast, too small, too maneuverable. His 5-inch shells were designed to engage cruisers and destroyers at ranges of 10,000 meters or more, against targets moving at 40 knots, turning on their own length, appearing and disappearing in seconds. The big guns were almost useless. "Hard left rudder," Hanami ordered. "Emergency speed. We're going through them." It was a desperate gamble. Instead of trying to evade the PT boats, Amagiri would charge straight through their formation at maximum speed, using her size and momentum to scatter the smaller craft, hoping to break through before more torpedoes found their target. It was insane. It was also the only option left. Amagiri turned toward the thickest concentration of PT boats and accelerated. Her bow wave rose higher. Her engines screamed at maximum power. On the bridge, Hanami gripped the railing, watching the PT boats grow larger in his binoculars, waiting for the torpedoes he knew were coming. The PT boats scattered as Amagiri charged toward them. Some turned hard left, others right, opening a gap in their formation. But they did not flee. They maneuvered to maintain attack positions, circling like wolves around wounded prey. Hanami saw one boat cut so close across his bow that he could see the faces of the American crew, young men in life jackets and helmets, manning their torpedo tubes, their machine guns. The boat fired. 2 torpedoes launched from less than 300 meters. At that range, there was no time to evade. Hanami could only watch the white wakes streaking toward his ship and pray they would miss. The first torpedo passed beneath Amagiri's keel, running too deep. The second torpedo struck the port side aft, below the waterline, near the aft engine room. The explosion threw Hanami against the bridge railing. The deck heaved beneath his feet. Metal screamed as the hull plates buckled. The lights on the bridge flickered, went out, came back on dim as emergency power kicked in. Damage reports came immediately over the voice tube. The aft engine room was flooding. The port shaft was damaged, vibrating badly. Speed was dropping. 20 knots, 15, 10. Amagiri was dying. Get damage control teams to the aft engine room, Hanami ordered, his voice mechanical, trained responses overriding the shock and fear. Seal all watertight doors. Transfer ballast to starboard to compensate for the list. But even as he gave the orders, he knew they were futile. The torpedo had torn a hole 6 meters across in his ship's hull. Water was pouring in at a rate the pumps could not match. The aft section was flooding. Within minutes, the flooding would spread forward, overwhelming the watertight compartments one by one. Amagiri would sink. The only question was how long it would take. The PT boats sensed the kill. They closed in, circling the wounded destroyer, launching more torpedoes. Hanami counted 6 more wakes, converging on his ship from different angles. His gun crews kept firing, kept trying to hit the darting targets, but their fire was slower now, less coordinated. Men were being pulled from the gun crews to fight fires below decks, to shore up damaged bulkheads, to carry wounded to the aid station. The destroyer was hemorrhaging crew members to damage control, even as she was hemorrhaging her life into the black water. Another torpedo struck. This one hit forward, near the bridge. The explosion was massive, directly beneath Hanami's feet. The deck erupted upward in a geyser of twisted metal and fire. Hanami was thrown through the air. He hit something hard, felt ribs crack, tasted blood in his mouth. When he could see again through the smoke and dust, he realized half the bridge was gone. The forward bulkhead had been blown away. Bodies lay scattered across the deck, some moving weakly, others still. Nakamura was one of the still ones. His executive officer lay against the remains of the helm station, his chest torn open, eyes staring at nothing. Hanami tried to stand. His left leg would not support his weight. He looked down, saw his uniform trousers soaked with blood, saw bone protruding below his knee, shrapnel from the explosion. He grabbed a piece of twisted railing and pulled himself upright, pain shooting through his leg in waves that made his vision darken. "Sir!" A voice behind him. Ensign Watanabe, the junior officer of the watch. The kid was 22 years old, looked 16, had joined the ship 3 months ago, fresh from the Naval Academy. His face was white with shock, blood running from a cut above his eye, but he was alive, functional. "Sir, the captain is ordering abandon ship." "I am the captain," Hanami said, confused. Then he understood. Watanabe meant the captain of the destroyer Arashi, the formation commander, senior to Hanami, the admiral in charge of the entire mission. That captain was ordering all ships to abandon their vessels and save their crews. Hanami looked around what remained of his bridge. The ship was listing 15 degrees to port now. Fires burned amidships where the torpedo had detonated near the fuel bunkers. The forward gun had been silenced, its crew dead or fled. Only the aft guns were still firing, and their rate of fire had slowed to sporadic shots as ammunition ran out and crew members abandoned their stations. Amagiri was finished. She would sink within minutes. "Sound abandon ship," Hanami ordered. "Get the men off. Get them into the water before she goes down." Watanabe nodded and disappeared down the ladder. Hanami heard the alarm sound throughout the ship, a harsh klaxon that cut through the noise of battle. Men began emerging from below decks, some helping wounded shipmates, others carrying life rafts, all moving with the controlled urgency of sailors who knew their ship was dying. Hanami limped to the bridge wing, gripping the railing, watching his crew abandon ship. They went over the side in good order, no panic, sailors helping each other into the water, forming groups that clung to debris and life rafts. The PT boats had stopped firing. They circled at a distance, engines idling, watching the destroyer sink. Hanami understood. The Americans did not fire on survivors in the water. It was one of the few mercies in this merciless war. Another explosion shook Amagiri. Not a torpedo this time, but a secondary explosion, as fire reached the forward magazine. The bow section disintegrated, blown apart from within. The destroyer began to settle by the bow. her stern rising as water poured into her forward compartments. She was going down fast now. Hanami had perhaps 2 minutes before she took her final plunge. He looked around the bridge one last time. This was his command, his responsibility. These men had trusted him to bring them home safely. He had failed them. Nakamura lay dead at his feet, the helmsman dead at his station, the signalman dead by the radio. How many more throughout the ship? How many men were trapped below decks, unable to escape the flooding compartments, drowning in darkness as the water rose? Sir, Watanabe was back, climbing the ladder to the bridge. Sir, you need to abandon ship now. She's going down. Go, Hanami said. Get off the ship. That's an order. Not without you, sir. Watanabe moved to Hanami's side, put an arm around his waist, took his weight. Come on. We go together. They went down the ladder together, Watanabe supporting Hanami's weight, moving as quickly as Hanami's shattered leg would allow. The deck was canted at 30 degrees now, tilting forward and to port. Walking required holding onto railings and stanchions. They passed dead sailors, past wounded, sailors being helped over the side by their shipmates, past fires burning out of control because there was no one left to fight them. At the main deck railing, Watanabe helped Hanami into a life jacket, tied it securely. Below them, the water was covered with floating debris, life rafts, and the heads of swimming sailors. The PT boats maintained their circle, watching but not approaching. One boat had its searchlight on, illuminating the scene, helping the American crews identify survivors, count the men in the water. Jump on 3, Watanabe said. 1, 2, 3. They jumped together, falling through darkness, hitting the water with a shock that drove the air from Hanami's lungs. The water was warm, blood temperature, but the impact sent waves of pain through his shattered leg that made him gasp and choke. Watanabe surfaced beside him, grabbed his life jacket, kept his head above water. I've got you, sir. Just float. I've got you. Hanami floated, watching his ship die. Amagiri's bow was completely submerged now. Her stern rose higher and higher, propellers visible above the waterline, still slowly rotating as the shafts turned. Men were jumping from the stern, tiny figures silhouetted against the flames consuming the ship. Some jumped clear, others slid down the sloping deck into the water. At 23:15 hours, exactly 75 minutes after Hanami had first spotted the PT boat wakes, Amagiri's stern rose vertical, pointing at the stars like an accusing finger. She hung there for perhaps 30 seconds, balanced between the air and the deep. Then she slipped beneath the surface with barely a sound, pulled down by the weight of water flooding her compartments. Where a 2,000-ton destroyer had been, now there was only disturbed water, debris, oil slick, and 400 men floating in the darkness. The PT boats moved closer. Hanami watched them approach, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. But the boats did not attack the survivors. Instead, several boats began circling the area, their engines idling, their searchlights sweeping across the water. One boat approached Hanami and Watanabe. A young American sailor leaned over the side, called down in English that Hanami did not understand. Watanabe, who had studied English at the academy, translated. He's asking if anyone needs immediate medical attention. He says they're marking our position for Japanese rescue. Hanami stared at the American. The man was perhaps 20 years old, wearing a life jacket and a helmet with the letters PT stenciled on it. This man had just participated in sinking Hanami's ship, killing hundreds of his crew. Now he was asking if survivors needed help. War made no sense. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Tell him Lieutenant Suzuki has severe burns, Watanabe called up. And Petty Officer Tanaka has a head injury. He keeps losing consciousness. The American nodded, spoke into a radio handset. Minutes later, another PT boat approached, this one with a medical corpsman aboard. The Americans pulled Suzuki and Tanaka from the water, treated their wounds, gave them morphine for the pain, then placed them back into a life raft with other wounded Japanese sailors. The PT boat left medical supplies floating in waterproof containers. bandages, antiseptic, morphine ampules. Then the boats withdrew, their engines accelerating, disappearing back into the darkness. Hanami floated in the oil-slicked water, surrounded by his surviving crew, watching the PT boats leave. He counted them as they departed. 38 boats. He counted them 3 times to be certain. 38 PT boats had attacked his 4-destroyer formation. Not the 12 to 15 boats intelligence had estimated for the entire Central Solomons. 38 boats in a single engagement, in one small strait, coordinating their attacks with precision that suggested excellent training, excellent communications, and an operational doctrine far more sophisticated than anything he had been led to expect. If there were 38 boats here, in Blackett Strait, how many boats did the Americans have in total? 50? 100? More? And where had they come from? American industry was supposed to be focused on building battleships and carriers, the capital ships that would decide the war. Yet somehow they had also built dozens, perhaps hundreds, of these small attack craft and deployed them throughout the Solomons in a coordinated campaign that was strangling Japanese supply lines. Hanami thought about the intelligence briefing that morning. 12 to 15 boats. The estimate had been wrong by a factor of 3 just for this one location. How wrong were the estimates everywhere else? How many other Japanese commanders were sailing into ambushes based on intelligence that bore no resemblance to reality? A Japanese submarine surfaced 2 hours later, its conning tower breaking through the black water like a sea monster emerging from the depths. It had been shadowing the destroyer formation, staying submerged during the battle, surfacing now to rescue survivors. The submarine could not take everyone aboard. Her interior spaces were cramped, designed for a crew of 90, already holding that many men. She could take perhaps 50 survivors, priority for wounded and officers. Hanami was pulled from the water, his shattered leg sending bolts of agony through his body as sailors lifted him onto the submarine's deck and down through the conning tower hatch. Below, in the cramped, oil-smelling interior of the submarine, a medical officer examined his leg, gave him morphine that dulled the pain to a distant ache, told him the leg would require surgery, told him he was lucky to be alive. Hanami did not feel lucky. He felt like a failure. He had lost his ship. He had lost more than half his crew. Hagikaze was gone with all hands. Shigure was crippled, might not make it back to Rabaul. Only Arashi had escaped intact. 4 destroyers had entered Blackett Strait. 1 had escaped. 1 was crippled. 2 had been sunk. 700 soldiers who had been aboard those ships for transport were dead, drowned when the ships went down, or floating in the water waiting for rescue that might never come. The mission had been a complete disaster. As the submarine Dove, heading north at maximum speed to escape American air patrols at dawn, Hanami lay on a narrow bunk in the officers' quarters, staring at the curved hull above him, listening to the throb of electric motors pushing the submarine through the dark water. He thought about the PT boats. 38 boats. Where had they come from? How had American forces assembled such numbers without Japanese intelligence detecting the build-up? The submarine reached Rabaul 36 hours later, surfacing in the harbour at dawn on July 17th. Ambulances waited at the dock to transport wounded survivors to the naval hospital. Hanami was carried on a stretcher, his leg immobilized in a temporary splint, morphine keeping the pain manageable but leaving his thoughts fuzzy and disconnected. At the hospital, surgeons operated on his leg. They removed bone fragments, debrided damaged tissue, set the break with metal pins. They told him he would walk again, but with a limp. They told him he would never serve aboard a ship again. His seagoing career was over. He would spend the rest of the war in staff positions, analysing reports, writing assessments, trying to understand how his navy had lost control of waters it had once dominated. 10 days later, when Hanami could sit up in bed without morphine clouding his thoughts, a staff officer from Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters visited him. The officer brought a notebook and questions. He wanted Hanami's detailed account of the battle. Date, time, location, number of enemy boats, their tactics, their weapons, their coordination. Hanami told him everything. The 38 PT boats, attacking from 3 directions. The sophisticated tactics, boats working together to set up kills. The torpedoes launched from multiple angles simultaneously, the searchlights and radios that allowed the boats to coordinate in darkness. The staff officer wrote everything down in precise script. When Hanami finished, the officer closed his notebook and looked at him for a long moment. "You said 38 boats?" "I counted them 3 times, Hanami said. 38 boats, I'm certain. Our intelligence estimates 12 to 15 boats total in the Central Solomons. Your intelligence estimates are wrong." The staff officer did not argue. He had heard similar reports from other survivors, other captains. The evidence was accumulating. American Mosquito boat strength was far greater than anyone had believed possible. "I will include your report in our assessment," the officer said. "But I must tell you, Tokyo is skeptical. They believe captains under attack at night are seeing the same boats multiple times, counting them as separate contacts. They believe the actual numbers are much lower." "I know what I saw," Hanami said. 38 boats. And if there were 38 boats in Blackett Strait, there must be hundreds of boats throughout the theatre. The Americans have deployed an entire fleet of these craft. They're not using them defensively. They're using them offensively, to control the waters, to stop our supply runs. They're winning. The staff officer did not respond. He gathered his notes and left. Hanami never learned whether his report reached Tokyo, whether anyone acted on the information, whether his warnings about American Mosquito boat strength influenced Japanese strategy. He suspected they did not. The Imperial Navy had been trained to think in terms of fleet battles, battleship duels, carrier strikes. Small boats did not fit that paradigm. They were beneath consideration, even when they were sinking destroyers with terrifying regularity. In August, still recovering in the hospital, Hanami received visits from other survivors of PT boat attacks. Each captain told similar stories. Destroyer runs that encountered not 2 or 3 boats, but dozens of boats attacking simultaneously. Transport convoys swarmed by coordinated flotillas. Supply missions aborted because the number of attacking boats made success impossible. The pattern was clear. American Mosquito boat strength was not 12 or 15 boats. It was not even 50 boats. It was hundreds of boats, deployed throughout the Solomons, operating from hidden bases, coordinating their attacks with sophisticated tactics. One visitor was Captain Katsumori Yamashiro, who had commanded the destroyer Arashi during Hanami's last mission. Yamashiro had escaped the battle, brought his ship back to Rabaul intact. He sat beside Hanami's hospital bed and spoke quietly about what he had seen. "I counted 42 boats during that engagement," Yamashiro said. 42 boats attacking 4 destroyers. The mathematics are impossible. If they have 40 boats in one strait, they must have hundreds throughout the theatre, and we have no counter. Our destroyers can't fight them effectively. They're too fast, too small, too numerous. "What is headquarters saying?" Hanami asked. "Officially? They're saying captains are exaggerating. They're saying we're seeing the same boats multiple times and counting them twice. They're saying the actual numbers are much lower." Yamashiro's expression was bitter. "Unofficially? They know the truth. They know we're being overwhelmed. But they can't admit it because admitting it means admitting the Tokyo Express is finished. And if the Tokyo Express is finished, we can't supply our garrisons. And if we can't supply our garrisons, we lose the Solomons." "How many supply runs are still being attempted?" Hanami asked. "Fewer each week. Last month we ran 12 missions. This month we've run 4. The losses are unsustainable. 2 destroyers sunk last week. 3 damaged the week before. The Admiral is considering suspending all runs until we can develop effective countermeasures." "What countermeasures? How do you counter hundreds of boats?" Yamashiro had no answer. There was no answer. Japanese industry could not build hundreds of small boats. Even if it could, there was no doctrine for employing them, no training for crews, no logistics system to support them. The Americans had created an entirely new form of warfare, and the Japanese had arrived unprepared. In September, Hanami was transferred to a staff position at Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters. His job was to analyze PT boat tactics and develop recommendations for countering them. He spent weeks studying after-action reports, interviewing survivors, mapping attack patterns. The data was overwhelming. Between January and August 1943, American PT boats and other small craft had attacked Japanese vessels 147 times in the Central Solomons alone. They had sunk or damaged 93 ships. The Tokyo Express had been forced to suspend operations. Isolated garrisons were starving. Hanami compiled his findings into a comprehensive report titled Assessment of American Mosquito Boat Operations in the Solomon Islands Theater. The report documented the scale of American operations, estimated total boat strength at over 300 craft, analyzed their tactics, and concluded that Japanese forces had no effective countermeasures. The report recommended ceasing all destroyer supply runs, evacuating isolated garrisons while evacuation was still possible, and accepting the loss of the Central Solomons. The report was forwarded to Tokyo. It was read by staff officers at Imperial General Headquarters. It was filed and forgotten. The recommendations were not implemented. The garrisons were not evacuated. The supply runs continued, with ever-increasing losses, until there were no ships left to make the runs and no garrisons left to supply. Hanami remained at his staff position through the end of 1943 and into 1944. He watched the slow collapse of Japanese operations in the Solomons. He watched American forces advance up the island chain, establishing new bases, deploying more boats, extending their control over additional waters. He watched the Mosquito boat fleet grow from hundreds to over 500 craft, an armada of small attack boats that dominated the coastal waters throughout the theater. In February 1944, Japanese forces evacuated their last garrison from the Solomon Islands. The campaign was over. The Americans had won. They had won not through decisive fleet battles or carrier strikes, but through patient, methodical control of the waters, interdicting supply lines, starving garrisons, making it impossible for Japan to sustain its forces. The Mosquito boats had been the decisive weapon, and Japanese intelligence had never seen them coming. Years after the war ended, Hanami was interviewed by Japanese historians studying the Solomon Islands campaign. They asked him what he remembered most clearly from that night in Blackett Strait, when Amagiri was sunk. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember counting the boats," he said. 38 boats. I counted them 3 times to be certain, and I remember realizing that our intelligence had been completely wrong. We thought the Americans had a dozen boats. They had hundreds. We thought they would use them defensively. They used them offensively. We thought we understood the nature of the war we were fighting. We understood nothing. The interviewer asked what lesson Hanami had learned from that experience. Hanami's answer was simple and devastating. Never assume your enemy is limited by your own limitations. The Americans had industrial capacity we could not imagine. They built hundreds of small boats while also building carriers and battleships. They supplied those boats with fuel and torpedoes in quantities we could never match. They trained crews and developed tactics we never anticipated. They created an entirely new form of warfare, and we had no answer. That was the lesson. We fought the war we expected. They fought the war they chose. And we lost. The PT boats that sank Amagiri have long since disappeared, scrapped or rotted away in the decades since the war. The men who crewed them have mostly died, taking their memories of that night with them. But the records remain. In the National Archives in Washington, there are after-action reports from PT Squadron 6, dated July 15th, 1943, describing an engagement in Blackett Strait. The reports confirm what Hanami saw. 38 boats participated in the attack. 4 destroyers were engaged. 2 were sunk. 1 damaged. 1 escaped. Mission accomplished. In Japanese archives, there is Hanami's report, yellowed pages covered in precise handwriting, documenting the battle from the other side. His count of 38 boats matches American records exactly. His analysis of their tactics proved accurate. His warnings about the scale of American operations were prescient, but his recommendations were ignored. The wreck of Amagiri has never been found. She lies somewhere in the waters off Blackett Strait, in the darkness 2,000 feet down, her hull broken, her guns silent, an eternal monument to men who fought bravely in a war their nation could not win. Somewhere near her lies Hagikaze, and scattered throughout the surrounding waters are dozens of other Japanese vessels, destroyers and transports and barges, all sunk trying to run supplies past the Mosquito boat fleet that controlled these waters. The Americans built 728 PT boats during World War II. 531 of them operated in the Pacific Theater. They sank hundreds of Japanese vessels, disrupted thousands of supply runs, and helped win the Solomon Islands campaign through patient, methodical attrition. They were not the decisive weapon of the war. That role belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines and, ultimately, atomic bombs. But in the Solomons, in the dark waters where the Tokyo Express once ruled, the Mosquito boats were decisive enough. Commander Kohei Hanami survived the war. He lived until 1982, dying at age 73 in a hospital in Yokohama. In his final years, he occasionally spoke to students about his experiences. He told them about the night Amagiri sank, about counting PT boats in the darkness, about realizing that everything he had been told about the enemy was wrong. He told them that wars are won not just by courage and tactics, but by industrial capacity and the will to use it in unexpected ways. The students asked if he was bitter about the defeat, about losing his ship, about his Navy's failure to anticipate American capabilities. Hanami said no. Bitterness served no purpose. The war was over. Japan had rebuilt. The important thing was to learn from history, to understand that assumptions about enemy limitations are often wrong, that wars are won by those who innovate and adapt, not by those who fight according to doctrine. In his hospital room in his final days, Hanami kept a photograph on his bedside table. It showed Amagiri at anchor in Rabaul harbour, taken months before she was sunk. The destroyer looked powerful in the photograph, her guns trained skyward, her flag flying from the mainmast. Hanami would look at that photograph and remember the men who had served aboard her, the sailors who had trusted him to bring them home safely. Most had died that night in Blackett Strait. Some had drowned when the ship went down. Others had been rescued but died later from wounds or disease. A few had survived, scattered now across Japan. Old men with memories of a war fought long ago in waters that are now peaceful and empty. Hanami would look at that photograph and think about the 38 PT boats that had sunk his ship. He wondered sometimes if any of those boats had survived the war, if they were preserved in museums somewhere, if American veterans gathered around them and told stories about the night they sank a Japanese destroyer in Blackett Strait. He hoped they did. Both sides had fought with courage that night. Both sides deserved to be remembered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.